at the edge of the known galaxy, where the trade lanes faded into cold and unclaimed stars, humanity was still seen as young, loud, and divided, a species that had climbed too fast and made too much noise for the old powers to ignore. In the great halls of the Galactic Assembly, where ancient empires spoke with pride and smaller worlds listened in fear, human diplomats were tolerated but never respected. They were called reckless by some, primitive by others, and dangerous by the ones who understood what rapid growth truly meant. Human colonies had spread farther in just a few generations than many older races had in centuries, and while their governments argued among themselves, their ships kept moving, their factories kept building, and their people kept surviving places where others would have given up. Admiral Jisu Han knew all of this long before the war began. She had stood in orbit over the colony world of Nara 7, watching supply ships rise from its thin blue atmosphere, and she had told Captain Una Park that the galaxy was too quiet. Una had laughed at first, thinking her commander was only tired after weeks of patrol, but when she looked out at the dark line of stars beyond the defense grid, even she felt it, the strange stillness that came before disaster. On the far side of human space, beyond the outer mining belts and ice harvest stations, a powerful alien coalition had already made its decision. They had watched humanity expand, watched human engineers turn broken stations into fortresses, watched human settlers make homes on worlds other species had marked as worthless, and they had become afraid. Not of what humans were, but of what they could become. So fear became policy and policy became war. Without warning, the first strike came at dawn over the colony moon of Hadion. The civilian comm relays went dark first. Then the orbital docks exploded in silent flashes of fire. Then the defense satellites, one after another, were torn apart by precision beams from ships no one had seen arrive. Families on the surface looked up and saw burning metal falling through the sky like rain. Before any message could reach the core systems, 3 more colonies were hit. Mining cities were glassed from orbit. Freight routes were cut open. Medical ships were destroyed even while broadcasting emergency codes. By the time the first full distress signal reached Earth and the inner worlds, millions were already dead. The Assembly called it a stability operation. The human worlds called it slaughter. In the command center above Mars, Marshal Day Kim stared at the casualty numbers while officers around him shouted over each other, trying to make sense of a war that had started before anyone had declared it. Beside him stood Commander Hannah Lee, young compared to most senior officers but sharp enough to see what others did not. The attacks were too clean, too coordinated, too broad. This was not a border clash or a political warning. This was an extermination campaign disguised as strategy. Humanity's outer defenses were built for raiders, pirates, and isolated conflicts, not for a united strike by some of the most powerful fleets in the galaxy. Still, the human response came faster than the invaders expected. Emergency shipyards switched from trade production to war production in hours. Civilian freighters were armored and armed. Local militias were folded into fleet commands. Reserve crews, retired captains, cargo pilots, engineers, and even station workers volunteered by the millions. Humanity did not pause to debate survival. Simply moved. Across burning systems, battered human ships began fighting back with a fury that shocked the invaders. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they refused to break the way the coalition had predicted. On the moon fortress at Kale Rift, Major Sora Choi held a trench line against alien assault troops for 11 straight hours while the surface above her collapsed under bombardment. In the black between stars, Captain Una Park rammed her crippled destroyer into the engine spine of an enemy cruiser after losing weapons, life support, and half her crew, taking both ships out in a blast that lit the void like a second sun. On the shattered station at Nara 7, Admiral Jisu Han directed point defense fire by hand after the tactical AI failed, turning the station's own cargo cranes into rotating gun platforms while civilians evacuated through burning corridors. Everywhere the coalition advanced, humans adapted in ways no one expected. If they lost shields, they used debris fields as cover. If they lost missiles, they rigged fuel haulers as bombs. If they were boarded, they vented whole decks into space and fought in vacuum suits among frozen bodies and floating sparks. But bravery could not erase math. The coalition had more fleets, older weapons, stronger alliances, and no concern for civilian loss. World after world fell. The colony of Mira Prime burned for 3 days while its oceans boiled under orbital fire. A convoy of refugee ships trying to escape through the Talon corridor was cut apart so completely that rescue drones found only twisted hulls and frozen children drifting among shattered glass. Human media tried to hide the worst images at first, but the truth spread too fast. Every home in human space saw the same scenes. Smoke over cities, broken stations spinning in darkness, soldiers making last stands on ruined ground. The war changed the human heart in those months. Old political fights stopped mattering. Borders between nations blurred. The names of leaders became less important than the names of the dead. In underground bunkers on fleet carriers, in ruined apartment blocks, and in overcrowded shelters beneath planetary shields, one belief took root stronger than any law. If humanity survived this, it would never be weak again. The coalition kept winning, but their victories grew expensive. They expected panic and surrender. Instead, they found traps. Human engineers mined asteroid belts and disguised the charges as abandoned cargo. Retreating fleets left false distress beacons that drew pursuers into kill zones. Entire moons were rigged to detonate their own defense reactors when enemy armies landed. Commander Hannah Lee became feared even among alien admirals for a tactic later called the Ghost Net, where damaged human ships pretended to drift powerless while hidden mines and cloaked gunboats waited in silence nearby. More than once, coalition commanders chased what looked like a broken remnant and vanished without a trace. Even so, the line kept moving inward. The coalition wanted a clean victory before humanity could fully unite, so they pushed harder, burning their own crews in endless assaults. They took Nara 7 after reducing its surface to ash. Admiral Jisoo Han was reported dead when the station finally broke apart, though no body was ever found. They broke the defense of Cinder Gate after 3 fleets died holding it. They reached the approaches to the inner colonies, where panic spread for the first time through worlds that had thought themselves safe. That was when Marshal Dae Kim gave the order that would define the rest of the war. Standing in the war chamber beneath Earth's northern shield grid, with casualty screens glowing red around him and half the fleet command demanding surrender talks, he chose something darker. Humanity would stop fighting to hold territory. From that moment on, it would fight only to bleed the enemy. Colony evacuations became priority over defense. Shipyards were abandoned only after being rigged to explode. Jump gates were sabotaged. Supply depots were poisoned with false fuel loads that turned engines into bombs. Entire star systems were emptied, trapped, and left waiting like buried knives. Some officers called it madness. Others called it the only honest answer left. Hannah Lee did not argue. She only saluted and began moving fleets. The coalition thought the human collapse had begun, but when they pushed into the abandoned systems, the nightmare started. In the dead orbit of Talos Reach, 3 coalition battleships were swallowed by a hidden gravity snare built from shattered station cores. In the frozen dark of Oran Belt, a pursuit fleet followed human survivors into an asteroid field and was torn apart by nuclear charges planted years earlier during mining operations. At Hadion, the same moon they had struck first, coalition troops landed to secure what remained of the surface and found every tunnel, reactor, and shelter packed with delayed charges. The moon cracked open beneath them. Even victorious fleets began sending reports filled with panic and confusion. Humans attacked from impossible angles, retreated when logic said they should stay, stayed when logic said they should run, and kept fighting long after command structures were gone. They weaponized grief. They weaponized memory. They weaponized every lesson the galaxy had taught them in blood. Still, even nightmares can lose ground. By the end of the first Savage Year, the coalition stood as the technical victor. The outer colonies were broken. Millions more were dead. Great human fleets were reduced to scattered remnants. Mars itself had taken bombardment scars visible from orbit. The assembly announced that humanity had been contained, its expansion ended, its future reduced to obedience. In alien capitals, leaders raised glasses and called the war necessary. In human space, no one celebrated survival because survival had come at a cost too great to measure. Cities were quiet. Shipyards worked in silence. Graves filled whole valleys. Marshal Day Kim looked across the ruins of Earth's orbital ring and understood that the war had not ended. It had only changed shape. In hidden bunkers, deep moon vaults, blacked-out shipyards inside dead rock, and scattered fleets gone dark beyond the charts, humanity began to disappear from the galaxy's sight. Not surrendering, not begging, not forgiving, just vanishing. The coalition mistook silence for defeat, but in the drifting wreckage of Nara 7, where scavengers later searched for scrap among broken hulls and frozen corpses, an old emergency beacon suddenly activated on its own. It repeated one human message across every open frequency, again and again, in calm and steady basic, as if spoken by the ghosts of the dead themselves. You should have finished the job. Years passed after the first Savage War, and across the galaxy, the old powers slowly convinced themselves that humanity had been broken for good. The great alien coalition that had once united to crush Earth's rising colonies no longer stood as one force, because victory had made them arrogant and greedy. Admirals who had fought side by side now argued over captured systems, trade routes, and mining rights. Politicians in the Galactic Assembly spoke proudly about lasting stability, while the species that had ordered the extermination campaign turned their fleets inward, more interested in power than caution. Human space, what little remained visible of it, looked quiet and wounded. A few battered worlds survived under heavy watch. Some frontier stations still sent weak signals. Refugees rebuilt small settlements in shadowed systems where no one cared to look. To the rest of the galaxy, humanity had become a ruined people, scarred but harmless, too busy mourning to threaten anyone again. But the silence that followed the war was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of something sharpening its teeth in the dark. In the outer lanes near the abandoned trade route of Vectal, a pirate fleet vanished without a distress call. There were no survivors, no debris trail large enough to study, and no clear weapon signature. Weeks later, a military patrol from one of the coalition member states disappeared near the old human mining belts. Then a black site prison station used to hold captured human soldiers went dark in a single night. When investigators arrived, they found the station still intact but powerless, drifting in cold space like a dead machine. Every guard was gone. Every cell was open. On the main command wall, burned into the metal with precise plasma cuts, were 3 simple words in human script. We remember everything. Those words spread through military channels like poison. Officially, leaders dismissed the incidents as sabotage, pirates, rogue AI, or border unrest, but fear began growing under the surface. The first one to see the pattern clearly was an alien intelligence officer named Terran Voss, a careful and disciplined analyst from a mid-level assembly species that had supported the First War but never led it. Terran had served in logistics during the conflict, far from the front, and he had spent years afterward reviewing battlefield records and classified archives. He was not emotional, not reckless, and not easily fooled by rumor, which was why his superiors listened when he quietly asked for access to files others had ignored. The destroyed pirate fleet had been carrying stolen human industrial parts. The missing patrol had entered a dead system once used by human fuel miners. The prison station that went dark had held officers who participated in the bombardment of Mira Prime. None of the attacks were random. Someone was choosing targets with memory, patience, and perfect knowledge of old sins. Terran requested deeper scans, but many commanders laughed at him. Humans, they said, were too weak, too divided, too damaged to strike with this level of precision. Even if a few survivors still fought, they could not possibly be building fleets in secret. Terran did not argue loudly. He simply kept digging. In hidden space far beyond the ruined frontier, where dead stars and ion storms blinded long-range sensors, humanity had not spent those years grieving in weakness. It had spent them changing. Deep inside the hollow shell of an airless moon, shielded by layers of rock and old mining debris, a shipyard the size of a city burned with constant light. Massive frames of warships hung in zero gravity like iron skeletons waiting for flesh. Old civilian factories had been rebuilt into foundries. Damaged coalition technology, salvaged from the First War, had been torn apart and studied piece by piece. Human engineers who once designed cargo engines now built silent drive systems that left almost no detectable trail. Scientists who had watched their families die under orbital fire now created gravity-lance cannons capable of punching through shields and armor in one brutal strike. Drone swarms the size of insects could slip through vents, disable reactors, blind sensors, and kill bridge crews before alarms even finished sounding. There were no wasted movements in those places, no political banners, no old national flags. The nations that had once argued over resources, borders, and pride had become something else after the war. They had fused under necessity, fear, and memory. Old governments still existed in name on some worlds, but real power now flowed through a central war command built around survival. Every child born in the hidden systems grew up hearing the names of the dead colonies. Every school taught engineering, tactics, and emergency response alongside language and math. Every station ran drills for hull breach, boarding, radiation fire, and evacuation. Humanity had not become a peaceful people healing from tragedy. It had become a species trained by trauma. Marshall Day Kim, older now and carrying the weight of millions in his eyes, stood at the center of that transformation. His hair had gone gray. His face had hardened into sharp lines. But he was not alone. Commander Hannah Lee had risen beside him, no longer just a brilliant tactician but the architect of the shadow fleets that moved unseen between secret yards and hidden depots. Captain Unipark, once thought dead after the battle over Nara 7, had survived in a damaged escape pod and spent years leading deep reconnaissance missions into enemy territory. Even Admiral Jisoo Han, whose death had been announced across human space, returned from the void after being rescued by scavengers and hidden among resistance cells. Her body scarred but her mind sharper than ever. Together, they helped shape the new doctrine. Never waste strength on pride, never strike without purpose, and never allow the galaxy to forget what it had done. The first major act of humanity's return was not loud. It was surgical. In the heavily fortified shipyard of Karis Prime, one of the Coalition's proudest military production hubs, tens of thousands of workers and security forces followed routine schedules under massive orbital defenses. Patrols rotated. Cargo moved. Shields pulsed. The station had survived the First War untouched and had built many of the cruisers that burned human worlds. Then, in the middle of an ordinary shift, every sensor feed glitched for less than 4 seconds. Backup systems kicked in immediately. Internal lights flickered once. Security teams were sent to investigate. Then the station's core reactor split apart from the inside. Simultaneous detonations tore through docked warships, fuel reserves, shield generators, and command spines. Escape pods launched into vacuum only to be cut down by invisible rail fire from the darkness beyond sensor range. By the time nearby fleets responded, the entire shipyard had become a drifting ring of fire and metal. On the largest surviving fragment of the command deck, a single beacon activated, broadcasting one short message across every military channel in the sector. This was mercy. Panic spread faster than the debris. News networks tried to control the story, but too many witnesses had seen too much. Leaders who once mocked the idea of a human resurgence suddenly demanded emergency briefings. Terran Voss was called into high command and asked for answers by officers who had ignored him for months. He stood in a cold chamber beneath an assembly intelligence complex and projected attack maps into the air. The pattern was undeniable now. Every missing convoy, every dead prison, every vanished patrol, every silent sabotage had targeted those linked directly to the worst crimes of the First War. The strikes were not chaotic revenge. They were disciplined. They were historical. They were personal. One admiral asked him if he believed humans were behind Karis Prime. Terran looked at the floating image of the destroyed shipyard and answered with a calm that made the room colder than fear would have. "No," he said. "I believe the war created something worse than the humans we knew." While the assembly argued, humanity kept moving. Hidden fleets tested new weapons in empty systems. Training carriers drilled young pilots in swarm tactics and silent approaches. Boarding teams practiced in zero-G ruins built from the exact layouts of enemy cruisers. AI-assisted command systems predicted coalition responses and mapped weak points across entire sectors. Yet for all the steel and discipline, humanity was not a machine without pain. In quiet halls beneath the hidden shipyards, Memorial walls stretched for kilometers, engraved with the names of lost colonies, burned convoys, vanished families, and last stands no one outside human space would ever understand. Hannah Lee often walked those walls before battle planning, her face unreadable as she passed names carved into black alloy. Una Park kept a cracked piece of hull from the old Nara 7 defense station in her quarters. Jisoo Han, who had once believed diplomacy could still save lives, now spent her nights studying assembly voting records and targeting chains. None of them had forgotten. None of them intended to stop. Still, even inside the human command, there was tension. Some younger officers wanted open war immediately. They wanted worlds burned, capitals shattered, and every species that joined the first extermination campaign punished without limit. But Dae Kim refused to move too fast. He knew the difference between rage and strategy. He knew fear had to spread before fleets did. Let the galaxy wonder first, he told them. Let them doubt each other. Let them lose sleep. Let them remember what it feels like when death comes without warning. So humanity continued striking the edges, prisons, depots, weapon labs, secret listening posts, slave markets that used human captives, and supply chains tied to the old war machine. They cut out pieces of the galaxy like a surgeon removing rot. Civilian targets were avoided, not out of softness, but because Dae Kim understood the deeper wound. He wanted the guilty to know they had been chosen. He wanted the innocent to whisper about human restraint, because fear mixed with mystery was stronger than simple destruction. By the time the assembly finally voted for a renewed military response, the balance had already shifted. Fleets that should have been mobilizing found their fuel contaminated, their comms compromised, or their jump routes mined. Commanders began suspecting spies. Politicians accused rival species of sabotage. Old alliances cracked wider. And in a silent war room hidden inside a dead moon, under dim light and red tactical projections, Marshal Dae Kim stood before Hannah Lee, Una Park, and Jisoo Han as the final reports from Karis Prime finished loading. The first phase was complete. The galaxy was no longer certain that humanity was dead. It was beginning to understand that humanity had been listening from the dark the entire time. Dae Kim looked at the names of the worlds that had burned in the First War, then at the sectors still waiting for judgment, and his voice was low and steady when he gave the next order. Prepare the fleets, he said. We were their victims once. Now we teach them what survived. And far away, in the halls of the Galactic Assembly where old leaders once laughed at broken humans, emergency alarms began to sound as one more border fortress vanished from the stars without a single warning shot. When humanity finally stepped out of the dark, it did not return with speeches, demands, or banners of peace. It returned like a blade drawn across the throat of the galaxy. The first weeks of the counteroffensive were so precise and so sudden that many worlds did not even understand they were under attack until their fleets were already dead. Across the old war routes, supply depots exploded from within, jump gates failed at the exact moment military convoys entered transit, and command relays went silent just before human ships appeared out of sensor shadows. The species that had once joined the extermination war now found themselves hunted one by one, not with blind rage, but with a terrifying memory. Humanity did not strike random colonies. It did not waste fire on harmless stations or civilian worlds. Every target had meaning. Every name had a reason. The admirals who had signed bombardment orders against Mira Prime died when their private cruisers were cut open in empty space. The scientists who had built colony killer weapons vanished from secure labs that no one else even knew existed. Senate vaults holding classified war records were broken into, stripped clean, and then destroyed. Shipyards that had forged the fleets of the First War burned in silence before emergency shields could rise. It was not just war anymore. It was judgment, and the galaxy could feel it. Terran Voss, now promoted and forced into a central role within Assembly intelligence, watched the crisis spread faster than any official could contain it. He stood inside the command towers of the capital district, listening as sector reports arrived in waves. Fuel shortages, fleet disappearances, sabotage in military docks, border defenses collapsing without clear engagement. Every time commanders tried to predict the next strike, they were wrong, because human strategy no longer followed the patterns the galaxy had studied before the First War. The old humans had fought like desperate survivors. These new humans fought like patient predators. Terran tried to explain it to the Assembly's Emergency Council, but most of them still spoke the language of arrogance. Some wanted larger fleets. Some demanded harsher crackdowns on surviving human settlements. Some accused rival species of secretly helping Earth. Terran, exhausted and increasingly angry, projected the attack map across the chamber and showed them the truth. The human strikes were not aimed at territory. They were aimed at structure. They were cutting logistics, communications, fuel chains, repair hubs, and command centers. They were removing the skeleton before striking the flesh. They are not trying to win battles first, Terran told them in a cold voice. They are making sure your battles cannot happen at all. But even as he spoke, the warnings kept coming. In the frontier system of Varn, an entire cruiser group arrived to reinforce a defensive station and found its reactor already dead, its crew already gone, and its outer hull marked with a human message in burning letters. This is for the children of Talon Corridor. In the industrial belt of Sarek, 3 orbital refineries detonated one after another, cutting fuel to 4 sectors and trapping 2 major fleets in dry dock. At the prison moon of Koresh, where human survivors had once been used in bioweapon trials, the surface shields collapsed in a single pulse before boarding craft punched through the atmosphere like falling knives. The prison was emptied. The staff were left alive. Every wall was covered with the names of the human dead. Fear did what fleets could not. It spread everywhere. Merchant guilds rerouted trade lanes. Refugees flooded neutral systems. Insurance markets crashed. Politicians screamed at admirals. Admirals blamed engineers. Engineers found their own families trying to flee. Old alliances began to rot under suspicion. The Assembly had started the First War believing humanity was too divided to become a true power. Now the same old empires were learning what division looked like when it was turned against them. Deep within hidden human command, Marshal Day Kim watched the galaxy shake and did not smile. He had expected fear. He had planned for it. But he did not enjoy it. Around him, the war room inside the Hollow Moon Fortress was alive with motion. Tactical screens glowed red and blue across curved walls. Fleet icons shifted through sectors like ghosts. Commander Hannah Lee stood at the center pit with calm eyes and a sharp voice, directing the next wave of operations with the same ruthless clarity that had made her feared in the First War. Captain Una Park handled the hunter groups moving behind enemy lines, her experience in survival and recon turning impossible routes into clean strikes. Admiral Jisoo Han oversaw target selection, ensuring every operation remained tied to the crimes of the old campaign. That mattered to her more than anyone. She had survived the fall of Nara 7. She had seen children die in vacuum because someone in a distant chamber had called it acceptable collateral. She would not allow humanity to become random in its vengeance. "We do not burn for sport," she told younger officers whenever they pushed for civilian attacks. "We remember exactly who lit the fire." Still, the counteroffensive was only in its first true phase. The deeper goal was larger than fear. Humanity needed the galaxy's military spine broken before the empires could unite again. That meant the next strike had to be visible, undeniable, and devastating enough to erase any illusion that humans were still just raiders in the dark. The chosen battlefield was the dead system of Korra's Reach, a barren star with scattered wreckage from the First War and no civilian presence for 20 light-years. Intelligence indicated that one of the Coalition's proudest admirals, Voron Kal, had gathered a massive armada there to lure out the human fleets. Kal's plan was simple and arrogant. He believed humans would attack the convoys he had intentionally exposed near the system edge. Once they did, his hidden reserve fleets would trap them in open space and crush them with superior numbers. The Assembly called it the beginning of the end for the human insurgency. Terran Voss, reading the deployment logs, felt cold when he saw the plan. He knew enough now to understand that if a trap was this obvious, it was because the humans had already seen it. He sent warnings. They were ignored. In the silent dark around Korra's Reach, humanity was already waiting. Years earlier, long before the Coalition chose this system for its grand ambush, human salvage teams had used the battlefield as cover. They seeded broken asteroids with mines. They hid dormant drone nests inside dead cruisers. They mapped the solar wind patterns around the unstable star. They planted false debris signatures, decoy transponders, and sensor echoes designed to confuse large formations. Most importantly, they built the kill zone not for the first fleet to enter, but for the second. When Admiral Call's forward force detected a small human raider group near the convoys, he did exactly what Dae Kim expected. He sent the bait fleet forward and committed his reserves to the chase. Human ships appeared weak, scattered, and desperate. They fired only enough to look frightened, then retreated deeper into the system. Call's commanders laughed. They thought they had broken the myth. Then the star itself seemed to wake. Hidden charges ignited along old wreck lines, sending clouds of molten debris through the approach vector. Cloaked drones activated in swarms, slamming into shield arrays and blinding targeting systems. Mine clusters erupted beneath the reserve fleets, tearing destroyers apart from the inside out. A solar flare, predicted months in advance by human astronomers, rolled across the inner system at the exact moment Call's formation entered its most vulnerable alignment. Communications shattered into static. Navigation grids flickered. And from the black behind the ruined moon fragments, the true human fleet emerged. They did not arrive in parade formation. They came in layered waves. Fast attack ships first, then missile carriers, then heavy cruisers, then the dreadnought line, dark and brutal and scarred like weapons built from memory itself. Some still carried hull plates from the First War, patched over but never replaced, as if the damage had become part of their identity. At the center of it all was Hannah Lee aboard the command dreadnought Iron Dawn, her face lit by tactical screens as she gave orders without raising her voice. Lock the gate line, break the carriers, leave the flagship for boarding. What followed became one of the most feared battles in modern galactic history. Coalition ships died in clusters before they could turn. Cruisers fired into ghost contacts and hit their own escorts. Human rail fire punched through shields already weakened by drones and flare disruption. Boarding pods slammed into battleship hulls like meteor strikes, cutting through armor with thermal saws while Marines in black vacuum armor poured inside. Unipark led one such boarding wave personally, crossing into a burning carrier where gravity had failed and fighting room to room through smoke, sparks, and floating bodies until the command bridge was taken. On the outer line, Jisoo Han directed the heavy batteries against Call's flanking force, timing every salvo to herd them into drifting mine belts hidden inside the wreckage of their own dead. Call's flagship tried to break out, but Hannah Lee had planned for that too. Human frigates sacrificed themselves to cripple its drives, and then the Iron Dawn moved in through fire thick enough to melt ordinary hulls. The flagship was not destroyed from afar. It was boarded. Hours later, when the battle ended, Admiral Call was found alive on his own bridge, kneeling among the bodies of his crew, forced to watch the live feeds of his fleet being erased before Hannah Lee spoke to him through an external channel. She did not threaten him. She did not shout. She simply said, "Remember Mira Prime." Then his command core was cut free and transmitted back toward assembly space as a drifting monument to failure. The Battle of Korra's Reach lasted less than 6 hours. By the end of it, one of the coalition's finest armadas no longer existed. The few survivors who escaped carried stories that spread like disease. Human ships fighting with half their hulls on fire, Marines advancing through decompressed corridors without slowing, wounded officers refusing retreat, dreadnoughts emerging from darkness like graveyard giants. Some swore they had seen a human cruiser continue firing even after losing its bridge, as if the entire crew had already decided death was simply another tool. Whether all the stories were true did not matter. Fear made them stronger. Across the galaxy, military planners rewrote threat assessments overnight. Civilian networks whispered a new saying in markets, refugee camps, and station bars. If human ships appear, the system is already lost. Terran Voss heard that phrase repeated by a terrified logistics officer outside the emergency chamber, and he knew the war had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Humanity was no longer just surviving, no longer just taking revenge in the shadows. It had proven in open battle that it could break the galaxy's strongest fleets and do it with terrifying control. Inside the Galactic Assembly, panic finally overcame pride. Emergency alarms sounded through the ancient halls as delegates rushed into sealed chambers under guard. For the first time since the First War, the question being asked was no longer how to punish humanity, or even how to contain it. The question, spoken in fear by species that had once voted for extermination, was far simpler and far more desperate. Could they still be stopped at all? After Korra's reach, the galaxy did not simply fear humanity. It began to live in fear of what human memory could reach. Trade lanes emptied. Military convoys moved with escorts 3 times larger than before, yet still vanished if they crossed the wrong system at the wrong hour. Border worlds, once proud of their alliance with the old coalition, suddenly lowered their flags and claimed neutrality. Some lied. Some begged. Some tried to erase records of what they had done during the First War, but humanity had already stolen those records from hidden vaults and sealed archives long before the panic truly began. Every new strike carried a purpose that was more terrifying than raw destruction. A weapons lab that had tested atmosphere-burn agents on human refugees was cracked open and left in vacuum, its scientists alive in emergency bubbles long enough to see their own data broadcast to the galaxy. A command moon that had directed the slaughter at Talon Corridor lost power, shields, and life support within minutes, yet the civilian habitats were spared while only the military sections burned. Across dozens of systems, people started whispering the same thing in frightened voices. The humans are not mad, they are precise, and that makes them worse. In the hidden war room beneath the Dead Moon Fortress, Marshal Day Kim studied those whispers through intercepted civilian feeds and military reports, and the truth in them weighed heavily on him. Precision had been the shield that kept humanity from becoming monsters too quickly. But even precision had a cost. Each victory made younger officers bolder. Each successful strike fed a hunger that had been born in fire years ago. Human crews had grown up on stories of glass colonies, dead convoys, and parents who never came home. Many of them had never known the softer version of their species at all. To them, the galaxy had always been a place that smiled before it killed. So when new targets appeared on tactical screens, some commanders no longer asked whether the strike was just. They only asked whether it would hurt enough. Commander Hannah Lee saw that change before most others did. She had built the shadow fleets. She had trained the officers who now moved through enemy space like knives. She knew the edge of the weapon she had forged. During one operation against a fortified industrial world called Brechtal, a young strike leader requested permission to collapse the planet's orbital ring entirely, even though the lower civilian sectors would suffer from the debris. His argument was simple. The ring had supplied ships during the First War. The workers below had cheered when human colonies burned. Why spare them now? Hannah did not raise her voice when she denied the request. She only ordered him off the command net and took control herself, using a slower, harder assault that destroyed the military docks but preserved the habitats below. After the battle, she stood in the briefing chamber while the young officer glared in silence, and she said words that spread through the fleet almost as fast as any victory report. "If we kill everyone who stood near evil," she told him, "we become the thing that taught them how." Yet even Hannah could not stop the darker current from growing. The galaxy had made humanity strong, but it had also made humanity cold. Captain Una Park, once the fearless scout who survived Nara 7 and smiled in the face of impossible odds, now led boarding actions with a calm that unsettled even veteran Marines. She never wasted life. She never broke discipline. But she no longer looked away when enemy officers begged. On the shattered bridge of a captured cruiser, she once listened as a coalition commander insisted he had only followed assembly orders during the bombardment of Mira Prime. Una stared at him for a long time before replying. So did the gunners who fired on the children. And then she turned away while her team locked him in a holding cell for tribunal transfer. She still obeyed the law Day Kim had built, but the law was all that held her. Admiral Jisoo Han felt it too, perhaps more than anyone. She had once believed that exposing the truth would force the galaxy to face what it had done. But each new archive they uncovered only made the truth uglier. One classified vault, seized from a fleeing assembly courier chain, contained records so dark that even hardened human officers fell silent reading them. Human surrender offers had been rejected on purpose because the coalition feared a surviving population might recover too quickly. Civilian evacuation routes had been targeted because panic would accelerate compliance. Bioweapon trials had been approved on captured colonists because human biology was considered strategically useful for long-term suppression. Entire worlds had been sterilized and listed in public records as industrial accidents. Jisoo spent a full night alone with those files, and when morning came, she walked into Dae Kim's chamber with eyes like stone. "If the fleet sees all of this at once," she said quietly, "some of them will ask for extinction." Dae Kim did not disagree. He had read enough already to know how close humanity stood to a line it might never cross back over. But before he could decide how to use the truth, the galaxy began changing in unexpected ways. Terran Voss, still trapped inside the assembly machine he had once served without question, had also found pieces of those hidden records. Unlike many around him, he no longer believed the official version of the First War. He had watched too many lies collapse. He had watched too many proud leaders panic when evidence surfaced. Quietly, at great personal risk, he began leaking fragments of the truth into neutral channels and independent networks. At first, only a few systems listened. Then more. Refugee worlds replayed the files. Neutral stations translated them into a dozen languages. Civilian commentators asked why human children had been listed as acceptable collateral. Traders demanded to know why medical convoys had been marked as legal targets. For the first time, parts of the galaxy began to see humanity not only as the nightmare in the dark, but as the nightmare that had been created by older monsters wearing uniforms and titles. That shift changed the political map almost overnight. Some worlds opened secret communication lines to Earth. Some offered safe harbors or medical aid. Some simply refused to let assembly fleets refuel in their space. Others, especially those deeply tied to the old coalition, reacted with fury and fear. They called the leaks human propaganda. They declared martial law. They began arresting dissidents, seizing networks, and preparing for a war they were no longer sure they could win. In the middle of that rising chaos, the surviving great powers made their last desperate choice. They formed a final coalition not out of confidence but out of terror. Every remaining major fleet, every reserve armada, every fortress moon, every deep-range carrier group, and every loyal mercenary wing was pulled together under a single emergency command. Their target was not Earth. They knew better now. Their target was one of the hidden human industrial systems, a place the assembly had only recently located through blood, bribery, and years of desperate signals analysis. The Dead Star region of Hadion Deep, where one of humanity's greatest war foundries lay buried inside hollow moons and shielded rock. If they could crush that system, they believed they could break the human spine before the capital worlds themselves came under threat. Terran Voss learned of the operation through emergency briefings and knew immediately how catastrophic it could be. He had spent years trying to understand human behavior, and by then he understood one thing clearly. If the coalition struck a hidden human home and slaughtered civilians again, whatever restraint Dae Kim still held might die with them. Terran did the one thing he had never imagined doing when his career began. He betrayed the assembly completely. Through a stolen relay chain and a narrow encrypted burst hidden inside trade traffic, he sent the fleet routes, timings, and command frequencies directly toward a human listening post. He expected to be arrested within hours. Instead, the net around him remained quiet, which somehow made the wait worse. In Hadion Deep, the warning arrived while Dae Kim, Hannah Lee, Unipark, and Jisoo Han were still debating the release of the classified atrocity files. The tactical display lit up with enemy formations so vast that even veteran officers fell silent. Hundreds of warships, carrier walls, siege cruisers, fortress tenders. More firepower than the coalition had committed since the First War. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Hannah Lee leaned forward, eyes narrowing as she studied the approach vectors, and she understood what the enemy was trying to do. They were not coming for a raid. They were coming for annihilation. The battle that followed was unlike the clean surgical strikes that had defined humanity's return. It was brutal, close, and savage in a way that dragged every survivor back to the First War. Hidden guns erupted from moon crusts. Minefields bloomed in black space. Human fighters swarmed in clouds so thick they looked like metal storms. But the coalition had come prepared, and this time they had enough mass to force the fight anyway. Shield layers shattered under siege fire. One human dock ring split apart and burned. A hidden carrier nest was exposed and gutted before it could fully launch. Unipark led intercept squadrons so deep into the enemy formation that half her pilots did not return. Jisoo Han held the inner defense line around the foundry moons, coordinating fire through comms half-blind from jamming and damage. Hannah Lee moved between sectors with relentless precision, plugging holes, sacrificing smaller groups to save the larger structure, making terrible choices in seconds because there was no time for mercy. At the center of it all, Dae Kim remained on the command deck of the flagship Resolute, refusing every request to relocate. He watched human ships die by the dozens, watched emergency beacons flash and vanish, watched names appear on the lost screens faster than the system could sort them. When the coalition finally pushed a breach toward the civilian shelter moons, hidden behind the industrial line, something in him hardened with a clarity that felt almost like grief becoming steel. He committed the reserve. Ancient hulls from the First War, rebuilt wrecks that had been kept in the dark as symbols and weapons both, surged out from beneath the dead moon shadows like ghosts answering a final call. They hit the coalition flank so hard that the enemy formation folded inward on itself. For 6 more hours the system burned. Then, slowly, impossibly, the coalition line broke. Some fled. Some surrendered. Some died where they stood. Humanity held Hadion deep, but only barely. The victory came wrapped in smoke, blood, and wreckage. Thousands were dead. Parts of the foundry were gone. Several shelter habitats had been breached. Rescue crews were still pulling children from shattered compartments when the first victory report spread. No one celebrated. Not really. On the observation deck of the Resolute, looking out at a field of burning debris and drifting human dead, Dae Kim felt the weight of every warning he had ignored and every restraint that had almost failed. The final coalition had attacked his people's hidden heart. If Terran Voss had not sent that message, the shelters might have died before the guns even woke. And if the enemy ever tried such a strike again, he was no longer certain the fleet would choose justice over extermination. Hannah Lee joined him in silence. Yuna arrived later, helmet under one arm, dried blood on her sleeve that was not all hers. Jisoo Han came last, carrying the fresh casualty slate. They did not need many words. The battle had said enough. Somewhere far away, the species that led the First War still sat behind fortress walls on their capital world, protected by rings, moons, and lies. As Dae Kim looked over the wreckage of Hadion Deep, he understood that there could be no more half measures. The galaxy would not stop until the old architects of genocide were dragged into the light. He turned from the stars, his face unreadable, and gave the order that sent a cold wave through every human command channel. Prepare the fleet for the capital. The order to prepare for the capital moved through human space like thunder through steel, and for the first time since the savage First War, every hidden shipyard, every blacked-out dock, every fortress moon, and every deep space relay came alive at once. Humanity was no longer striking from the edges. It was marching straight toward the heart of the empire that had begun it all. Across the dark lanes beyond the assembly's control, fleets gathered in silence, not as scattered hunter groups or shadow task forces, but as a single force so large that even veteran officers stood still when they saw the final numbers. Dreadnoughts rose from hollow moons. Missile carriers emerged from asteroid shipyards. Rebuilt cruisers from the First War, their old scars still visible beneath fresh armor, took position beside new warships built in secret and sharpened by years of revenge. Some hulls still carried the names of dead colonies painted along their sides, as if the fallen themselves were being brought to witness the end. On the flagship Resolute, Marshal Dae Kim stood before the full command staff with Commander Hannah Lee at his right, Admiral Jisoo Han at his left, and Captain Unipark just behind them, her face calm and unreadable after too many battles to count. The room was full of officers who had grown up in the ruins of the First War, officers who had never known peace except as a story from old recordings. And Dae Kim knew many of them wanted one final answer written in fire. He let the silence hold for a long moment before he spoke. "We are not going to their capital to become what they were," he said in a low, steady voice. "We are going there to end what they built." Some looked relieved. Some looked disappointed. All of them listened. The target world, known across the galaxy as Verex Prime, was the political and military core of the species that had led the extermination campaign years before. It was a fortress wrapped in pride. 3 defense moons circled it in layered formation. Orbital rings housed rail batteries large enough to crack cruisers in one hit. Planetary shields were tied to buried fusion cores beneath entire mountain ranges. Around the world itself waited the last surviving grand fleet of the Old Order, reinforced by loyal coalition remnants, mercenary carriers, drone swarms, and enough mine screens to make direct assault seem almost suicidal. The enemy leaders believed they still had one final advantage. Even if they lost the outer line, they thought humanity would break itself trying to take the capital. They did not understand that humanity had been preparing for this moment since the day its first colonies burned. Long before the main fleet entered Verex space, Unipark's recon teams moved ahead through routes mapped over years of hidden observation. Human stealth craft slipped through debris shadows and dead sensor cones, planting signal ghosts, false transponders, and relay disruptors. Sleeper drones attached themselves to shield nodes and maintenance channels. Jisu Han's intelligence cells activated hidden contacts inside neutral trade stations around the capital, blinding key listening posts and flooding the local net with false warnings. Hannah Lee coordinated the opening wave with ruthless precision, breaking the battle into layers the way a surgeon breaks bone before cutting deeper. When the first alarm sounded on Verex Prime, the enemy believed it was another border strike, maybe a sabotage run, maybe a feint. Then the stars filled with human engines. The human armada did not arrive in a single wall. It came in vast staggered formations, some visible, some masked, some delayed on purpose so that the enemy could never be sure what was real. Thousands of drive signatures lit the dark around Verex. The defense moons opened fire first, turning the void into lines of white death. Human destroyers died in the opening minutes, cut apart before they could complete attack vectors. Carrier screens vanished under missile storms. A cruiser named Dawn River took a direct hit through the spine and kept moving anyway, launching its last boarding wave before breaking in half. The battle became so massive so quickly that no single tactical screen could show all of it at once. Above Verex Prime, orbital rings burned. Around the outer moons, mine clouds detonated in chains that looked like new stars being born and killed in seconds. Human missile swarms crossed paths with enemy interceptors in walls of fire. Some ships rammed when guns failed. Some fought with engines blown out, using maneuvering thrusters and desperation to stay in the line. The galaxy watched through stolen feeds, military leaks, and civilian networks that could not look away. Many had expected a slaughter. They were right. They had simply guessed the wrong side. On the Resolute, Dae Kim watched losses mount on both sides and knew there would be no clean victory here. He had planned for that. The first objective was not the planet. It was the defense moons. Hannah Lee directed 3 separate strike groups toward them, each designed to look like the main attack, while Unipark led the true breach through a narrow path only her scouts had mapped, hidden behind a field of drifting wreckage from an ancient battle long before the First War. Her assault wing came in dark, engines cut low, using the bodies of dead ships as cover until they were almost on top of the nearest moon battery. Then they lit everything. Boarding pods slammed into the moon's outer armor. Cutting charges blew through maintenance tunnels. Human marines poured into gun decks and reactor hulls in zero gravity, fighting room to room in red emergency light while the battle outside shook the entire structure. Una herself led the push to the central control core, moving through smoke and broken bulkheads with the same cold focus she had carried since Nara 7. When the defenders tried to seal the chamber, she blew the doors inward and took the core alive, forcing the moon's own guns to turn and fire on the second defense moon before the enemy could override them. The result ripped a hole in the orbital line so violent that even veteran commanders on both sides stared in shock. Hannah Lee did not waste the opening. "All heavy groups forward," she ordered. "Break the rings now." Human dreadnoughts surged through the gap like iron storms. Some were newly built monsters with gravity lance cannons. Others were ancient survivors from the First War, patched and rebuilt until they looked like graveyard legends wrapped in steel. One by one, the outer ring batteries died. One by one, The fortress carriers guarding the capital were hunted down, isolated, and torn apart. Still, Verex Prime fought back with the rage of a dying empire. Planetary shields held. Ground-based lances reached into orbit and speared human hulls from below. Entire sectors of the battle became too full of wreckage to navigate cleanly. Jisoo Han, running the upper command net with blood on her collar from a deck impact, coordinated fire across 5 broken channels and 3 damaged fleets, turning human losses into angles, angles into traps, and traps into kills. At one point, when a loyalist battleship group nearly reached the Resolute, she used the burning remains of 2 destroyed carriers as improvised cover, luring the enemy into a crossing line of rail fire that shattered their flagship and sent the rest drifting blind. Hours passed. Then more. The defense moons fell. The orbital rings cracked. One of the planetary shield cores was destroyed when hidden sleeper drones, planted weeks earlier, overloaded the transfer relays beneath a mountain vault. For the first time, Verex Prime itself was exposed. Panic spread across the capital. Civilian channels erupted in confusion. Government bunkers sealed. Military command towers demanded reinforcements that no longer existed. The leaders who had once signed extermination orders from safe chambers now stared at the impossible truth on their own screens. Humanity had reached the gates. Deep under the capital, inside the command citadel built to survive orbital war, the surviving rulers of the old empire gathered in fear and denial. Some still insisted on total resistance. Some demanded negotiations. Some tried to destroy records and flee through hidden escape shafts. None of them got far. Human strike teams, guided by Jisoo's stolen maps and Terran Voss's final intelligence packet, breached the lower defense tunnels just as the last outer shield failed. Terran himself was there, not as a soldier, but as the witness who had finally chosen a side. He had been extracted days earlier by a covert human team after his cover collapsed, and now he stood in borrowed armor at a secured relay chamber while Unipark's Marines cut deeper toward the command levels. He had once served the assembly with loyalty. Now he listened as the same voices that had mocked human suffering begged for evacuation codes and mercy. Above them, the human flagship line took position over Verex Prime. One order from Dae Kim could have ended the world. Orbital fire solutions were ready. Planetary population centers were mapped. If he wanted revenge in its purest and darkest form, it was all within reach. On every surviving channel, the galaxy held its breath. Many expected him to do it. Some believed he had earned it. Even among the human fleet, some officers waited for the command that would erase the species that had started the first war. Dae Kim stood in silence, staring at the tactical image of the world below, and for one terrible moment even Hannah Lee was not sure what he would choose. Then the old man who had carried humanity through fire gave the order that changed everything. "No civilian strikes," he said. "Kill the war command. Disable the fleet. Break the empire." The words moved like a shockwave through every deck. Precision fire began immediately. Human guns did not rain destruction across cities. They carved apart military grids, shield cores, bunker doors, launch silos, defense towers, and command spires. Boarding teams hit the citadel. Unipark reached the central chamber where the architects of the First War were trying to transmit one last lie to the galaxy, and she cut the broadcast only long enough for Dae Kim to replace it. Across every open frequency, every civilian network, every military channel, and every emergency band from the core worlds to the frontier, the truth was released all at once. The hidden records, the rejected surrender offers, the sterilized colonies, the bioweapon trials, the orders to target evacuation routes, the names of the dead. Entire sectors watched in horror as the Empire's crimes spilled into the light. Then the camera shifted to the broken chamber itself, where the leaders who had once called humanity weak stood surrounded by human marines and their own shattered symbols of power. Dae Kim's voice came over the feed, calm and colder than any threat. "You made us into your nightmare," he said, "so no one else would have to face what we did. The war leadership was arrested or killed where they resisted. Their military command structure was dismantled in hours. Their fleets were stripped, scuttled, or seized. Their fortress world remained scarred but alive. Civilians were spared. Hospitals were protected. Emergency relief corridors were opened under human guard. The galaxy was stunned in a way no massacre could have achieved. Humanity had arrived at the capital with the power to commit genocide and had chosen judgment instead. That choice frightened the stars more than fire ever could, because it proved the truth at the center of the legend. Human mercy was real, but it was never weakness. In the weeks that followed, the old empire collapsed. Client states fled. Loyal fleets surrendered. The assembly itself fractured under the weight of truth, fear, and years of lies. Some worlds begged for treaties. Some requested human protection. Some simply lowered their weapons and prayed never to see a human battle line in their skies. Terran Voss later stood on a rebuilt observation platform over Varix Prime, watching human patrol ships move through the smoke of a broken age, and he understood at last what the galaxy would remember. Not just the terror, not just the war. It would remember that humanity had walked all the way to the edge of becoming monsters and then stopped by choice. Years later, far from the old capitals, on a small alien colony world that had never seen the First War, a child looked up at the silent black shapes of human patrol ships crossing the stars and asked why they were always there, always watching the dark. An old woman beside him, who had lived long enough to remember the lies and the fire and the day the truth finally came, looked at those distant lights and answered in a quiet voice. Because monsters remember what other monsters do.